My name is Ivana Nikolic-Hughes. I'm the president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. I'm also a senior lecturer at Columbia University. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this event in our Nuclear Danger series. We actually began this series this past spring, right after the Ukraine war began, and I'm delighted that today we're joined by Professors Benoît Pelopidas and Professor Marty Hellman to discuss nuclear dangers as they pertain to the Ukraine war and more broadly, but also to talk about the specific role that luck has played in the past and why relying on luck when it comes to nuclear weapons may not be wise. I'm really excited to introduce to you today's speakers, Professor Pelopidas and Professor Hellman. Benoît is an associate professor at Sciences Po in Paris. He's also an affiliate of CSAC at Stanford University. At Sciences Po, he founded the Nuclear Knowledges Program, which is the first scholarly research program in France on the nuclear phenomenon. Very interestingly, notably, the program refuses funding from both stakeholders of the nuclear weapons enterprise and from anti-nuclear activists. Beyond his work on luck and nuclear close calls, Professor Pelopidas researches the effects of funding on nuclear discourse. He was awarded the most prestigious European Union grant from the European Research Council to conduct a 5-year research project on nuclear weapons choices. I'm also really excited to welcome Professor Marty Hellman, who is Professor Emeritus of Electrical Engineering at Stanford University, which is my alma mater. I actually have a PhD from Stanford. He is best known for his invention with Diffie and Merkel of public key cryptography, which is the technology that's hard to pronounce, let alone to understand what it really is. But I think we can all relate to the fact that among other uses, cryptography actually enables secure intranet transactions. So every time you press one of those buttons and think like, what's happening, Marty's truly behind that. He is currently focused on rethinking national security, and in the chat, we're going to actually put in some links and information so that you can explore both Benoît's and Marty's resources. Professor Hellman is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, and he is the recipient of the ACM Turing Award, which is often referred to as the Nobel Prize of Computer Science. So beyond the biographies, I also do want to introduce them in slightly more personal terms, and to say that I had really known about both of them for many years for different reasons, and I won't go into all of those details. But I only met both of them personally and spoken to both of them personally this year. And there was a sort of a moment of nexus that I have to try to describe as succinctly as I can. But I had, just after NAPF had announced that I would be the next president, Marty was actually the first person to write me and to congratulate me. And we fairly quickly had a phone call. And in that phone call, he recommended that I read the book of his and his wife's, Dorothy, A New Map, here it is, A New Map for Relationships, Creating True Love at Home and Peace on the Planet. And I literally spent about 2 or 3 days, I was traveling and I was in Paris, and with jet lag, I actually was reading, and you'll get the link in the chat because there's a PDF version of the book. And I was reading the book at night on my phone, and I just couldn't stop. But I was jet lagged, so it was okay. And I loved it. And a few days later, so this is sort of where it all comes together. It was Benoît in Paris. My husband, Emlyn Hughes, who's also on the call, and I were teaching a summer course to 15 Columbia students and had invited Benoît to come. And Benoît was speaking, and I had just been reading this book. And so I was, at one point, I was just dying to tell him about this book that he perhaps didn't know about. And when I said that, Benoît sort of looked at me and said, you know, Marty and I are friends. I'm about to go and stay with him and Dorothy at Stanford in September. So anyhow, it feels really appropriate to have both of them with us. And thank you all for being here with us. So I'm going to, I'm just going to hand it off to Benoît for some introductory remarks. And then we'll go to introductory remarks by Marty, and then we'll go to a discussion portion. So thank you again.
Thanks, Ivana. And so good morning or good evening or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thank you, Marty, for agreeing to have this conversation. I'm just going to give you like a short set of remarks on the topic of luck, which I've written about and researched for roughly 5 years. So the UN Secretary General has started the 2022 NPT Review Conference by saying, quote, "We have been extraordinarily lucky so far, but luck is not a strategy," end quote. That's the title of our session. The representative of Costa Rica also referred to the role of luck in the avoidance of unwanted nuclear explosions over the last 77 years, mentioning the words of former US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. So in my 10 minutes, I want to make 3 arguments on that subject. First, the words of the UN Secretary General and of Mr. McNamara are neither weird nor rare. There is actually a long list of policy and military officials who have claimed that we have relied on factors beyond human control to avoid nuclear explosions in specific episodes since the 1960s. Second, the necessary role of luck in key episodes of the nuclear age is no longer a debatable claim. It is now established by scholarship free from conflicts of interest and empirical evidence from archives as well as interviews. 3, this is not a matter of the past only. For a variety of reasons, current long-term nuclear weapons policy planning still relies on luck. So let's start with the long and probably incomplete list of officials from the US, the Soviet Union, the UK, and international organizations who have invoked the role of factors beyond human control as necessary to avoid unwanted nuclear explosions so far. They call them luck, chance, or divine providence. Beyond Mr. McNamara, the list includes Dean Acheson, President Kennedy's special envoy dispatched to France at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Nikolai Leonov, head of Cuban affairs in the KGB at the same time, and Gerard C. Smith, chief US delegate to the strategic arms limitation talks. More recently, since the end of the Cold War, one should add former Secretary of State George Shultz, former National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Chairman of the Senate's Armed Forces Committee Sam Nunn, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, and former head of the Strategic Air Command and Strategic Command General Lee Butler, as well as UK's Secretary of State for Defense Lord Des Brown of Ladyton, and former IAEA Director General Hans Blix. That was boring, that was the list, and that was also my first point. The key point in my second argument is that we now know that they were correct. It's not just about building something out of their celebrity. To decide the matter, to decide the role of luck, it was important to first become able to distinguish cases in which the avoidance of unwanted nuclear explosions could be attributed to control from the cases in which it could not. Otherwise, we would misattribute all cases of absence of explosion to success of control. To avoid that trap, I have identified three types of cases in which luck was necessary. When what prevented the explosion happened independently from control practices, thanks to the failure of at least one of the control practices, or despite the failure of at least one of the control practices. None of those types, none of those types of cases can be labeled as control. They all have to be called luck. Because of limited time, I will only give you one example. The Goldsboro episode in the sky of North Carolina on January 24th, 1961. On that day, the refueling of a B-52 bomber went wrong. The plane broke apart and two 3.8 megaton bombs, that is 250 Hiroshima each, went into free fall. Only one switch prevented the explosion. And one cannot argue that the control system worked properly, since in the 20 years that followed, records show that the same switch failed more than 20 times. The explosion was thus avoided thanks to the non-coincidence of two failures that did occur: the dislocation of the plane in mid-air and an inadvertent electrical discharge that would have set the bomb to explode on the ground. This non-coincidence is independent from control procedures, and it is fortunate that we live in a world in which two thermonuclear explosions did not strike North Carolina 61 years ago. I would be happy to give you other examples in the Q&A, and would invite you to look at the publications and the video that give you more evidence and that are listed in the chat. This account of the role of luck in the avoidance of unwanted nuclear explosions is most likely incomplete for several reasons. The cases I found of limits of control are not known in most nuclear weapon states. They remain classified. We are most likely blind to such cases in recent decades, since even in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, considered to be one of the most important and best documented crises in the nuclear age, it took more than 3 decades for light to be shed on its real danger and on the role of luck in its non-catastrophic outcome. In order to not jeopardize their careers, guardians of nuclear arsenals have an interest in keeping disobedience and technical failures quiet, and we now know that they did. Physicist Sidney Drell, author of an influential report on the subject presented to the US Congress in 1990, identified 32 cases of nuclear weapons-related accidents, broken arrows, in US history. He told me in 2013 that he was convinced that multiple others remain secret. So assuming that my assessment of luck is complete would be tantamount to assuming that while the US alone has had dozens of cases of that kind, the 7 nuclear weapons programs about which we know very little have experienced none. That would be a particularly optimistic assumption. This takes us to the third and last part of my argument tonight. One might wish to reassure oneself that luck, which has prevented unwanted nuclear explosions so far, will have no role to play in the future, given the progress made in weapons safety. In other words, we would have regained perfect control over nuclear weapons. This confidence seems excessive to me for the following reasons. First, one cannot but observe that there is pressure in the opposite direction. Deliberate loss of control is being discussed in the name of the credibility of the retaliatory threat. This is manifested in the renewed proposals to automate or delegate to artificial intelligence the command and control of nuclear weapons. Moreover, the modernization undertaken to counter possible hacking problems is leading to an increase in the complexity of nuclear weapons command and control systems, creating new possibilities for systemic accidents, which are a priori unforeseeable. Second, in order to assert with confidence that we're now in complete control, we would need to be able to verify claims of progress in weapon safety in all nuclear armed states. However, the institutions in charge of the control of nuclear weapons have every incentive to overstate their control and archival evidence shows that they have regularly done so in the past when they're not entirely opaque. Claiming anything but perfect control would be to admit to a failure of their primary mission. Third, if the institutions in charge of stockpile control do indeed come to believe their own communication campaigns, their weapons have become perfectly safe, this confidence in their ability to solve all the problems they encounter can lead to complacency. We have seen this in the careless practices of US Air Force ICBM officers in recent years. Fourth, let us remember that accidental explosions are only one manifestation of the loss of control over a nuclear crisis. Uncontrolled escalation or unauthorized firing can also lead to an unwanted nuclear explosion. From this perspective, desirable safety advances do not exhaust the physical vulnerability to which nuclear weapons expose our world. Finally, high-level military authorities are on the record saying that they rely on fortuitous disobedience somewhere in the chain of command in case of a crazy order to launch. This is an acknowledgement of the role of luck, understood as people will know when to disobey and will do so only in those circumstances. This is the opposite of control, of course, given that the control procedure is that no one should ever disobey. And this is not a fantasy of scholar, right? This was visible in the testimony of STRATCOM Commander General Robert Kaler before the US Congress in November 2017, as well as in recent commentary of the war in Ukraine by high-level military officers in the French media. So to wrap up, allow me to remind you of the three takeaways from this brief opening remarks. Numerous policymakers and high-level military personnel have invoked the role of luck in the avoidance of past unwanted nuclear explosions for decades, even if they would have benefited from doing the exact opposite. Scholarship free from conflicts of interest now demonstrates that in key episodes, we have avoided unwanted nuclear explosions thanks to the failure of control practices or thanks to factors which are independent from control practices or in spite of the failure of control practices. In other words, we now know that we lucked out. And for the reasons I've just outlined, current long-term planning still relies on luck. So contrary to what Secretary General Gutierrez said, not only are we acting as though luck were a strategy, but we choose the strategy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benoît. Thank you for those remarks. It's always chilling to actually think how close things have gone so many times over the decades, and at some level, how little we've learned. Let's go to remarks by Marty, and then we'll open it up for a broader conversation.
Thank you, Ivana. So some people believe that luck is irrelevant and that we've not had a third world war because nuclear deterrence can work forever, perfectly forever. Former Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger was in this camp when he said in 2009, quote, "We will need a strong nuclear deterrent more or less in perpetuity." In contrast, I see luck as playing a significant role. We're playing a global version of Russian roulette. Last year, prior to the war in Ukraine, I estimated that we were pulling the trigger in that macabre game about once every 15 years. So more than 5 times over the life of a child born today. Today, I only have time to outline why that's true, so I'll refer you to a report that I recently wrote, 60 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Time to Stop Playing Russian Roulette. It has more details and can be downloaded from my publications page, and NAPF has put it in the link in the chat, or you can email them for it. As just one example from that report, luck clearly played a role in the 1999 Pristina airport crisis. And many of you may be unaware of that, but that's when a British 3-star general refused an order from an American 4-star general by saying, "Sir, I'm not starting World War III for you." So given that 2 high-level NATO officers differed, there is a reasonable chance that other such officers, both assigned to these positions, two of them would have taken the action that risked starting World War III. And which officers are assigned to those positions depends on chance, on luck. That report also describes war games that were supposed to stay limited, but that escalated uncontrollably to nuclear war. Those war games provide evidence that we've dodged the nuclear bullet by not getting into a war between the major powers where such escalation could occur. But Ukraine is testing that firebreak. So luck is definitely involved. In fact, I was kind of astounded to see that anyone questioned that, but I guess they do. Luck is definitely involved, and we're playing nuclear roulette. If we keep pulling the trigger, eventually the gun will go off. We cannot stay lucky forever in perpetuity, as Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger said. When I wrote that report in early 2022, and I'm sorry, early in October 2022, so early last month, President Biden was warning of Armageddon, and our luck appears to be running thin in Ukraine. We need to better understand how we got into this mess so we can avoid it in the future, and maybe even bring it to an end before it blows up in our face. That's the subject of a section in the report, but the basic problem is failure to learn from our mistakes. Mistakes such as Cuba, 1962, Vietnam in my lifetime, Iraq in 2003, and Libya, 2011. As evidence that even Ukraine is more complex than most Americans think and than our media portrays, a June 2022 poll done by the University of Chicago, which I confirmed its authenticity, it was done in Ukraine. It found that, not surprisingly, 85% of Ukrainians blamed Russia for the war. But somewhat surprisingly, at least to Americans, 70% said that about their own government, and 58% said that about us, the United States. So luck is definitely involved. Now, since this is a Nuclear Age Peace Foundation event, let me say one reason that I really like Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. It combines two issues that are usually dealt with separately, the nuclear threat and peace. But they're intimately interconnected. The nuclear threat provides motivation to build a more peaceful world. It used to be just morally desirable to do that, but now it's essential for human survival. Every war has the potential to escalate out of control, with Ukraine being an excellent example, meaning a horrible one. In fact, if you go back to the book that Dorothy and I wrote, and again, there's a link for downloading a free PDF in the chat, or you can buy a hard copy on Amazon. If you search on Ukraine in the PDF, as I did recently, you'll find that even 6 years ago, I was warning about the danger in Ukraine. Secondly, a more peaceful world is a prerequisite to eliminating the nuclear threat. You can't just get rid of the nuclear weapons in the world as it currently exists. Posing the solution as nuclear disarmament creates opposition and arguments that are hard to deal with from our current perspective. Only when our foreign policy becomes more rational will nuclear disarmament and other proposed solutions be given serious consideration. Again, you can see my report with the link in the chat for more details. There are 5 levels that are really interconnected, not just nuclear war and conventional war, but also bad foreign policy and bad interpersonal policy and bad internal policy. So let me explain that. By bad interpersonal policy, I mean what my wife and I did 40, 50 years ago in our marriage that had us on the brink of divorce before we got things together. And the good news is not only did we save our marriage, but we haven't had a fight in almost 20 years, something that to my New York Jewish upbringing was beyond comprehension. And I have to credit Dorothy with that vision. And she says she couldn't have done it without me, and that's true. But something that is inconceivable is not necessarily impossible. In fact, there's a section in the book titled "Inconceivable Does Not Mean Impossible." And how is that connected to bad internal policy? If you've ever kicked yourself, you have a bad internal policy. The Bible says love your neighbor as yourself, but it leaves out an important part. You have to love yourself, and most of us hate our neighbors as we hate ourselves. In fact, there's a phenomenon called projection of the shadow side on an enemy. And in our book, there's an example of this. If you search on shadow or a dark side, There was a man who impressed me as an arrogant Jewish professor from New York. I'm Jewish, I'm a professor, I'm from New York, and arrogance was just too much to add to the mix. And I hated him with a passion. I hated the video he was in until I actually was forced to come to grips with that. That same thing goes on at an international level with Afghanistan 1979 probably being a projection of Vietnam. That is, we hated the Russians over their invasion of Afghanistan, even though there were similarities to our invasion of Vietnam in the 60s. And the Iraq War, I think the way we hate Russia over Ukraine may be projection over Iraq. So the book that my wife and I wrote, it's subtitled Creating True Love at Home and Peace on the Planet. It explains in more detail, and we've made a PDF freely available. Again, the link is in the chat or email an APF for it. Since creating true love at home and peace on the planet may not seem connected to most people, I'll give you a quick soundbite. Get curious, not furious. When Dorothy, my wife, used to do things that seemed crazy to me, I used to treat her as if she were crazy. That drove her crazy, convincing me I was right, keeping the energy loop going. Now I go to her, and when there have been instances where she's doing things that seem crazy to me, but I go to her and I say, I know you're not crazy, what am I missing? And when she explains her perspective, which is coming at it from a different angle, it immediately becomes brilliant. The last thing I'd like to treat is how risky are things now? Again, in March 2021, I wrote a paper which estimated that we're playing Russian roulette with the entire world about once every 15 years. And Bill Perry, the former Secretary of Defense, who has a PhD in mathematics, told me he agreed with that estimate. I haven't spoken to him about my more recent estimate, which is that we're now pulling the trigger with the war in Ukraine going on about once every year that the war continues. So by the way, people who say that a nuclear use in Ukraine is not likely are probably correct, because what's the risk of surviving Russian roulette? I'm sorry, what's the chance of surviving in a game of Russian roulette? 5 chances out of 6. You're most likely to survive pulling the trigger, but even one nuclear bullet in a 6-chambered gun is too much. Well, this leads to the question of what can you do? Again, NAPF has put the link to my website, the portion of my Stanford website on rethinking national security, or if you Google Hellman and Stanford, my homepage will come up, and at the top there's a big link to rethinking national security. And I'm really pleased that the first resource there is a short statement. You can read it in maybe 20 seconds. It's been signed by a former Secretary of Defense, a former director of NSA, and other people of a similar caliber. The key question asked in that statement, it goes as follows. In this age of nuclear weapons, pandemics, cyber attacks, terrorism, and environmental crises, is national security becoming inseparable from global security? And if so, how do our current policies need to change? I encourage you to read the statement and the report. And also at the bottom of the page, the Rethinking National Security page, there's a section, what you can do, a link to a separate page, and that has a number of things you can do. But I'll tell you, the best thing you can do is what I did initially, which is to create true love at home, true peace at home. You'll see immediate benefits. I can't point to one nuclear weapon that I've eliminated or one war that I've avoided, but every day my life is better because Dorothy and I no longer fight. And so I strongly encourage you to combine creating true love at home and peace on the planet. I have, and I'll tell you, it's really worth it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marty. You're reminding me of all when you were saying search for a particular section of the book. No, read the whole book, and then you'll find a lot more gems than just the ones that Marty pointed out. So I want to, if we can also have, let me just get Benoît on spotlight as well. I want to really begin to unpack so many interesting things that you've said here, but I want to start with the Ukraine war, just because that's definitely on all of our minds. And Marty, just to go back to you and the book, I was reading the book and thinking, goodness, they were seeing this, 6 years ago. And really, it was clear that you were concerned about generally the relationship between the US and Russia, and the way in which that relationship was playing out in Ukraine, specifically starting in 2014. So when the war began, was that sort of your worst fears coming to pass? Were you expecting that Russia would go in and invade?
The war in Ukraine was not my worst fear. My worst fear is a major nuclear war. So that was my second worst fear. And I was surprised by it. But that's why I estimated back in March 2021, before the war started, that's one of the reasons why I estimated that the risk of the use of nuclear weapons in a major nuclear war was about 1% a year, pulling the trigger in nuclear roulette about every 15 years, because there were many things. It could be over Taiwan, it could be Pakistan, India, it could have been Ukraine. And so, yes, I was surprised by Ukraine, but there are so many surprises that are possible. And we were obviously making mistakes, ignoring Russia's, the way a former Secretary of Defense put it to me very well. We were talking about another situation, North Korea and Iran. What he said to me is, we need to deal with their legitimate security interests so that they don't bring their illegitimate ones to the table. And the same is true of Russia and Ukraine. Both of them have legitimate security interests that need to be dealt with and that conflict to some extent. But we need to deal with both of them so that they don't bring their illegitimate security interests to the table. And while my heart goes out to Ukraine, I want to bring the war to an end there as quickly as possible, both to minimize the nuclear danger and to minimize the human suffering in Ukraine, which is horrendous. Right now, it seems like the United States wants to fight a proxy war in Ukraine with American money, American weapons, and Ukrainian blood. And I cannot justify that.
That was exactly perfect. I wanted to say amen to that, but I'll go to Benoît. Benoît, was this on your radar prior to the start of the war, on the radar of people in France? And how can we think about differences in the way in which the US and France have approached and handled the war and the conflict? Are there differences? If so, what are they? I'd love to hear a little bit more from your perspective.
Right. So this is one of the sad moments where, you can say I was right, but the world would be better off if you were not. So I always say the job of scholars is not to forecast. And as a matter of fact, I think a large majority of French observers, there are a few who said war is coming, but they were really like a very small minority. Most people till the end thought, no. And what's interesting there is that the argument immediately went to expectations of rationality. It would be irrational to do that. But interestingly, after it happened, everyone was like, oh, that wasn't rational. But then the expectation of rationality was moved into the discussion of nuclear danger to say, of course, that will not happen because that wouldn't be rational. So the fact that the previous claims based on expected rationality were not taken into account to revise the priors. I'm not myself here making any claims of rationality for anyone. I'm mostly making a claim about limits of learning of the community of commentators. And here I'm gonna be an unpleasant guest, because I know you've asked me about the differences between France and the US. But if I think about the connection with the topic of the session, I think the trouble is the similarities. In terms of, we've seen a similar tendency for overconfidence in like a sense of complete control, where there is a camp, both in France and in the US, that literally sees military escalation and continued support in a military fashion will lead to victory of the oppressed, defeat of the dictator, and the triumph of the good. And they essentially treat any consideration of danger or awareness of limits of control, limits of safety as playing the enemy's game, which even from a political and ethical point of view, I find, one, I mean, I find empirically dubious, but second, I find it ethically and politically strange, because if you want to fight for Ukraine, because most of those people say that, we fight for Ukraine, you should tell them, those are the risks we are willing to, take for you. But no, what is being said is, no, it's all bluff. And essentially the good will prevail. And I find this tendency present in France and the US, and I find it extremely dangerous.
Yeah, I just want to add something. When we use military force to try to help people, like responsibility to protect, the track record, the history is very poor. We used that in Libya under Obama. To some extent, we used it in Iraq under Bush in 2003. And both resulted in disasters, not only for the people of the country involved, but also for America's national security. And to show that it's not a uniquely American problem, Putin had, as part of his reason for going into Ukraine, responsibility to protect ethnic Russians. For example, I think 40 or 50 ethnic Russians were burned alive in Odessa in 2014 by Ukrainian nationalists. I won't go into the details. And so he had a fig leaf of a justification, and yet one would have to say what he's done there is far worse than 40 or 50 people dying.
Right, absolutely. But we have this really interesting dynamic, and I gather, Benoît, from your answer that you think the same thing is playing out in France as here in the US. It's not just that it's a war in which good must prevail and good must win over evil, and victory must be achieved. It's also that any attempt, even conversations around simply talking about diplomatic efforts to end the war, end up being treated as if peace is actually a dirty word. This is a phrase that Cynthia Lazaroff has used. So how do we actually overcome this? How do we sort of fight against this simplistic narrative of good versus evil, black versus white scenario, in which truly negotiations to advance a peaceful end to the conflict are either just dismissed or actually equated with, my sort of I find it most objectionable when you say, the next step should be diplomatic negotiations, and the answer is, how do you negotiate with Hitler? So I'm just curious what you both want to say. Maybe Marty, will start with you and then go to Benoît.
Okay, well, if Putin is really Hitler, we're sunk. Hitler and nuclear weapons would have been the end of the world. Fortunately, I believe Putin is not Hitler. And if I'm wrong, we're going to blow up. And if I'm right, we have a chance of not blowing ourselves up. So why not make that assumption? And whenever I hear a narrative of a war where one side is all good and the other side is all bad, I know that's an oversimplification. Even in World War II, we did some bad things. I mean, the Nazis were worse, but we did some bad things. And today, Russia is portrayed as all good, as all bad, and Ukraine is all good. As evidence that that is not the case, 3 years ago, 30 members of the US Congress tried to get the Azov battalion, an element of the Ukrainian military, declared a foreign terrorist organization. I spoke with one of those members of Congress at the beginning of the war, and he told me, well, we need to put that aside for now because they're the best fighters that Ukraine has. By the way, they were the defenders of Mariupol and the Azovstal steelworks. That was not usually stated. And also, again, remember that while 85% of Ukrainians blame Russia for the war, 70% blame their own government and 58% blame the US. So it's not, Russia is at most at fault. I agree with that, but we have some things we can work on. And I see that as hopeful because I learned that in my marriage. When I used to think it was all Dorothy's fault, I had to wait for this crazy woman to come to her senses before I could get out of pain. Once I realized that if I could find something I had done to start a fight, this goes back, as I said, more than 20 years ago, I could apologize for that. I could make that right, and that would start a process of reconciliation. And I think the same is true internationally. Benoît?
So I guess I would make three observations to address this question. The first one on the Hitler analogy. The first one is really that, of course, we should not give up moral judgment, but when we're making moral judgments, we should keep in mind that demonizing particular entities opens possibilities for justifying an endless amount of violence. So we should be aware of the consequences of demonization. And to really second your point, Ivana, about the Hitler analogy, I went to work with the Young Pugwash movement in Germany, like last month. And so I thought, it's Germany. They're going to be careful about the Hitler analogy. I didn't find them much more careful than anyone else. So I think that says something about how prevalent this is. So that's point one. The second one is really, when we talk about peace, I think we're engaged in the old debate and the old tension between peace and justice. Because if we think about peace only, and we say peace now immediately at any cost, then it's not stable peace, and it's ultimately surrender in legitimation of the hierarchy of force. So that's obviously not satisfactory. But then the question really is, okay, if we want to talk about peace with adjective, and let's call it just peace, then we have a whole ladder, a whole scale of just pieces. The top, the other extreme from peace with no adjective, the other extreme is a just peace that one camp defines as not making any concessions at all. So I think one way of thinking about that is, what kind of modes of peace on that ladder would we label just, and are we willing to work towards? And the third observation, to go back to something Marty said earlier, is it's definitely not the only criterion, but minimization of long-term harm could be a criterion that helps us adjudicate this.
Yeah, no, those are really, really excellent points. I just want to underscore a couple of things. One, Marty's point about, war is always being complicated, but also the idea that one really, all we at some level have the power to do is look inside ourselves. And I mean that, whether it's personal relationships, your and Dorothy's story about your marriage is very powerful, but it happens all the time, right? I mean, we all have many relationships of different types, and to always think about what can I do in this relationship, whether it's with my colleagues, with my students, with my children, with my husband, whoever it is, right? Always thinking about what can I do from my end to improve this relationship. And so to me, that's really a very important point in kind of thinking about what our approach should be.
Ivana, can I just add one thing?
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, I was involved in a panel at Georgetown, which is a Jesuit school. So I quoted from the Gospels, and being Jewish, I won't be accused of trying to convert people. In the Gospels, it's Jesus says something like, why do you worry about the splinter in your neighbor's eye when you have a 2x4 in your own? Now, what I said in the talk was, given that our neighbor in Ukraine is Putin, he probably has a 4x8 in his eye. But so I will paraphrase the solution. First, remove the 2x4 from your own eye. Then you have a better chance of helping your neighbor remove the 4x8 from his.
Yeah, that's a very good one. That's a very good one. But so let's go into I think there's a sort of a broader, interesting question about how nation states handle conflict in general, and how they think about conflict in terms of their own interests versus interests of humanity. And so I would argue with the Ukraine war, it's clear that humanity is suffering because of the war, right? Whether we're talking about food or energy shortages, and rises in prices, whether we're talking about the suffering primarily, of course, of Ukrainian people, but also Russian people, or whether we're talking about the risk of nuclear annihilation in case of escalation to nuclear exchange or nuclear war. How can we think about needs of nation states versus humanity as a whole?
So Benoît and I talked about this a bit, and we agreed that I would go first, because rethinking national security is fundamentally about that. Remember, it's about, I use national security, but it really moves to international security. I start with national security because that's where most people are, but you cannot have national security in the nuclear age and all the other ages we're in without having security for all nations, not just Russia, but Ukraine as well. And so a lack of that kind of holistic thinking has led to this war. It goes back at least decades. Bandera, who was sometimes viewed as a Nazi, and with some justification, he killed his Ukrainian militia, killed tens of thousands of Poles and Jews, and the fire in Odessa that I mentioned. But it also goes the other way, where Russia subjugated the Baltic states, it subjugated the culture in Ukraine. And what we need to do is to treat all nations with the respect that they deserve if they had nuclear weapons, because otherwise we are unwittingly encouraging nuclear proliferation. And worse yet, we, the United States, often does not treat nations even with nuclear weapons like Russia as if it deserves respect. In fact, Obama said when he was president, a man I admired in many ways, he said that he's much more worried about a terrorist nuclear weapon being set off in New York than he is about nuclear war with the Russians. He was wrong on that one, by the way, as we now see. Yeah. Benoît?
Okay, so I'll address Ivana's question, and then I want to kind of add on to some of the things you just said. So when we think about nation states in humanity, what we're talking about is political communities. And so if we do that, we need to keep in mind that for all people on the planet, the nation and humanity as a whole are not their primary community allegiance. You can think of like tribes, families, or people for whom humanity or the nation are not really the community that is the key defining feature of their identity. And so that brings us back to the nuclear condition of vulnerability, which brings us not just, and you could say, but wait, that's humanity. And my point here is not necessarily, because that connects us also with other forms of living being that would be affected by nuclear war. You know, there is, for example, recent new scholarship about what nuclear war and nuclear winter would do to marine life. So that's another way of thinking of modes of connecting different forms of life on the planet. And I think that's really interesting, because one of the things we've discovered in the debate about, for instance, what we call the Anthropocene, is the fact that there are planetary boundaries. So scholars are disputing how many there are. We talk about 9 mostly. And so let me pause here. I'm making an assumption, which is I'm assuming that humanity as a species is defined by belonging to planet Earth. I'm not getting into the let's colonize Mars nonsense. So assuming that humanity belongs to planet Earth, then those planetary boundaries, when we treat them in our thinking about national security, and that goes to what Marty was saying, we ask the question in the wrong order. often we say, okay, let's take climate change. Let's isolate one. Recently, there is a new subset of the conversation that says, you see, we're taking this seriously because we're looking at the consequences of climate change on national security. And what we should be doing is ask the question the other way around, which is, what are the consequences of our national and international security on climate change? Because that's the only way we're going to get to live on in a sustainable climate. A little plug here. We have a paper making exactly that claim called the Climate Security Reversed that has been published in Environmental Politics. And one kind of point, echoing what Marty was saying about, treating countries as if they had nuclear weapons. One of the findings of the book, and here, by the way, we've assumed that no one can read the book. The book, actually, it's a real book. It exists. It's in French. And I still believe that some people on this planet read French. So if you do, please. But one of the findings of the book really is that the last 3 decades are a moment of rare absence of proliferation. So the key is not to fuel the demand. So not to unnecessarily fuel the demand for nuclear weapons. It's crucial to kill this falsehood that had Ukraine kept its arsenal, it would not have been invaded. And I mean, I can explain why that's false. We have a colleague, Maria Rubli, who dedicated an essay to that. It's called Fantasy Counterfactual. It's in Survival and it's excellent. So let's not unnecessarily fuel demand for nuclear weapons.
And the thing I would add is, let's not have wars that might fuel the demand. That's why Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and those two things are so critical.
Yeah, no, thank you for pointing that out. To me, nuclear weapons truly are sort of the most dramatic expression of this, right? Because we really are talking about not just as you alluded, Benoît, with the recent studies of nuclear winter, which, by the way, have been enabled by our sort of ability to develop climate models and study climate change, and now applying all of that to what would actually happen if India and Pakistan had a limited regional nuclear war, or if US and Russia, for instance, used up something like 1/3 of their arsenals. What we see is not just hundreds of millions of people dying in attacked cities, it's really billions dying of starvation because of the sudden drop in temperatures. This would be with fires, actually soot going into the atmosphere, blocking incoming sunlight, temperatures dropping, food production failing, agriculture essentially failing. Under certain scenarios, US would have a 98% reduction in food production. And so we really are talking about risk to humanity to human civilization as we know it, and possibly to all of humanity. And so I guess I want to sort of come back to this question of what would it mean to make the world safer versus going to zero nuclear weapons? I guess, to me, given the risk of accidents and miscalculations that we sort of started the discussion with, and given that nuclear war would threaten all of humanity and not just those in attacked cities, this is not just, you can't say, and for instance, South Africa is a great leader on nuclear disarmament, but you couldn't say, oh, well, I'm in South Africa, no one's going to attack a city in South Africa, so we're all going to be fine. That it turns out not to be the case. So to me, the only acceptable risk is zero. And so to me, the only acceptable number of nuclear weapons is zero. So I wanted to raise that as a question. Zero versus making the world safer, and kind of immediate steps that need to be taken.
Can we, our visitors from afar, can we participate?
Yeah, we're gonna end the prepared discussion in about 10 minutes, I think. And then we'll have a Q&A till 3:30 East Coast time.
Thank you.
12:30. Yes, of course. All right, Benoît or Marty, do you want to
I think,
address?
Benoît, you were going to go first.
Okay, so I guess yeah, I'm thinking in 3 steps tonight. So the first step really is to observe that politically we're in a world in which we have 2 antagonistic understandings of security. One set of nation states think about security thanks to nuclear weapons, and another set of states thinks of security as security from nuclear weapons. And so one way, not necessarily of reconciling that, but of at least getting to a much better place than where we are now, is to get to a point of consistency and to say, look, at least the camp that says we want security thanks to nuclear weapons, they claim that this is because of deterrence. They want to practice nuclear deterrence. And so just saying, okay, let's go down to arsenals that are dictated by the requirements of nuclear deterrence only, just getting to that point gives us a massive margin for reduction. So then we can get into arguments about the requirements of deterrence and all of that. But we need to keep in mind that we're way above that level, even according to the US military. So that's kind of a first step for change that we have no reason to not to pursue. The second thing is, I really want to reiterate, it's crucial that we don't unnecessarily feel demand for nuclear weapons, in that we address the tension between the non-proliferation policy and the deterrence policy, when the deterrence policy relies on claims of prestige or complete control. This is why the luck argument is so important. It's also, I think, crucial, and that's why I wanted to engage with it immediately, not to equate absence of use with success of nuclear deterrence. That applies to the past and the way we've wrongly treated luck so far. And one of the things that the book does is to identify modes of denial of luck. But that also tells us something about how we handle the war in Ukraine, or how we think about it. Because let's assume, as we all hope, that the war in Ukraine ends without the use of nuclear weapons. I bet, and for once I will try to predict things, I bet that the pro-deterrence camp will say, this is a success of nuclear deterrence, we told you so. And my answer will be, it will be too soon to tell. If we end without the use of nuclear weapons, we will have to become able to assess whether nuclear threats have actually allowed that ending, facilitated it, or whether they've actually created unnecessary risk-taking in places, or whether they've actually made the war longer than it needed to be. This calls for, more studies, and we need to kind of push back against this equation of absence of use means success of nuclear deterrence, because it could be completely wrong.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I just want to, before going to Marty for his answer, I just want to mention that recently there's been this argument made on the part of the US that the reason we have to modernize and possibly even increase our number of weapons is China is planning to modernize. China has 300 nuclear warheads. The US has on the order of 6,000. China even increasing its arsenal should have absolutely no bearing on what the US does with the 6,000. That's at least my view. I mean, my view is the US should just come down to 1,000 weapons and then point the finger at Russia, who is the only other country to have nuclear warheads in the thousands. And that's really where this enormous, enormous danger lies. Not that 200 wouldn't be dangerous, but that it's more than plenty to destroy the world, and the thousands, to me, just there's a point at which they really don't serve any other purpose than enriching somebody in the military industrial complex. But Marty, let me
Okay. Thank you.
Comment on this.
So in my report on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which the link is in the chat, I have a diagram, which I'll just put up on the screen very quickly, and then I'll explain it. Let's see, it's this one. Okay. First of all, I define the desired state not as zero nuclear weapons, but a state of acceptable risk. And that's really important because if you say zero nuclear weapons, it creates all kinds of arguments, all kinds of objections. You're making World War III possible, and we remember how to build them. And whereas it's very hard to argue that we should not seek a state of acceptable risk. And it also raises the questions of what would be an acceptable level of risk. I also define, as you saw in that diagram, an intermediate threshold, I'll put it back up again, of 1,000 nuclear weapons worldwide, which is plenty for nuclear deterrence to still work. And yet it would take a fundamental shift in thinking that more weapons is more secure, which it is not. I mean, if China had 300 nuclear weapons for many years, because that's what they viewed as adequate. And so even if China builds up to 6,000, we have to ask, how many do we need to deter, if that's the purpose of our arsenal? But having an intermediate goal of 1,000 warheads worldwide is a really good intermediate goal, because it's a way to measure our success. And then once we get there, new possibilities open up that are currently inconceivable. Again, coming back to that section in the book Dorothy and I wrote on both interpersonal and international relations, inconceivable is not impossible. If you change the environment step by step, new possibilities come into view, both negatively, which is what's happened in Ukraine, and positively.
Yeah, and I really just to mention again your point from earlier, I really like the idea of treating every country as if it had nuclear weapons, right? I think that's really important.
Right, and that emphasizes that we don't neglect Ukraine's legitimate security interests either. We look at Russia's and Ukraine's both. They each have the legitimate security interests. And what we need to do is get rid of the ethnic conflict. We need to suppress that, because the ethnic conflict leads to war, which brings out the best and unfortunately the worst in all countries.
Absolutely, absolutely. Benoît, did you want to make an additional comment, or did I? Yeah. So let's
just two brief observations. One, simply to give a historical vignette of your point about what historian David Rosenberg called overkill. We have a memo from Robert McNamara to President Lyndon Johnson in December 1964, saying hundreds of 1 megaton weapons would be enough to deter the Soviet Union. And we're in 1964. The level of hostility is very intense. And so we are like massively beyond that level. So we need to keep that in mind when we define the requirements of deterrence. And so Sharon Weiner does fabulous work about how requirements of particular services get rebranded as requirements of deterrence, and how when you compare one moment to the next, the requirements of deterrence actually change massively. The second observation to China is really going back to my point about let's keep in mind planetary boundaries. Our planet can't afford a new global arms race, because that would contribute to accelerate the climate problem.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Let's talk about global warming and how you're both thinking about this challenge and how you see it in relation to nuclear weapons. I personally see so many connections and parallels, and also ultimately, Benoît, I think a point you made back in April when we were in an event together was that, no one wins if we solve the climate problem, but destroy the planet in nuclear war, or vice versa, right? We get rid of all nuclear weapons, we remove that threat, but in meantime, the planet and humanity suffer with ensuing climate change. So comments on this, it's clearly important, and I think the connections are not drawn or pointed out nearly enough. Who'd like to go first?
I can Marty, is that okay if I go first on this one? Okay, so I think the starting point for this conversation is to accept something really unpleasant, which is that there is more than one way civilization as we know it can end. And climate change, catastrophic climate change is one, collapse of biodiversity to a degree that, is destructive is another, nuclear war is a third one. So why am I making that point? Simply because communities seem to be focused on their own preferred modality of civilizational ending. For example, in the nuclear weapons community, you die in a nuclear war or in World War III, or you don't die. And you can see that the long-term planning, which essentially thinks about, keeping nuclear weapons until 2080, 2090, in the case of France, till the end of the century, the geopolitics that they talk about in 2100 is essentially today's geopolitics. It's a geopolitics where they don't assume catastrophic climate change. And similarly, if you look at the IPCC report, they talk about 2050 and beyond with an implicit assumption that nothing will go wrong with nuclear weapons between now and then. And we don't know that at all. So it's really crucial that we essentially incorporate planetary boundaries into nuclear discussions and incorporate the nuclear dangers in the discussions of future climate change. Those would be my two recommendations.
Excellent.
And that we think about how they affect each other.
Okay, I see nuclear weapons and climate change and many other problems as symptoms as opposed to the real problems. They're symptoms of a deeper underlying problem, which is the chasm between the godlike physical power that technology has given us and where our maturity level is as a species. At best, it's irresponsible adolescent, and we often behave like we're terrible twos. We throw tantrums. In the Bible, only God was supposed to be able to destroy cities like Sodom and Gomorrah with thunderbolts. We call them nuclear weapons. Only God was supposed to be able to create a flood that would necessitate Noah building an ark in that story. Climate change threatens the same thing today. We create new life forms on a regular basis, which again, in the Bible, only God was supposed to do. So the real problem is not any of those symptoms. The problem is the chasm. And so I often say that humanity is like a 16-year-old kid with a new driver's license who somehow gets his hands on a 500 horsepower Ferrari. We're either going to go up really fast or we're going to kill ourselves. And all of us in this event are working to make sure to increase the chances that we'll grow up before we kill ourselves.
Excellent. I love that analogy. That's also in the book. It's a really, really powerful analogy. And I think it brings together so many of the other threats, right, that the humanity faces. It's also about pandemics. It's also about biodiversity loss, and the way in which that isn't just about saving polar bears, because they're cute, as cute as they are, it's also ultimately comes back to us and what it means for us, and the way in which really all of these things interact. If parts of the world due to climate change become, if there are droughts, if there are fires, if there are storms, people will move. If they move, there will be conflict and limited resources, and so the connections really are there. It's very multifaceted. All of that said, I would like to end on a promising note. So where can we find some encouragement? In the book, Marty, you and Dorothy talk about the need to sort of extend our circle of care and concern to all of humanity, and describe how that circle has in fact gone larger and larger over human history. So how do we get there? How do we really truly think on, with the planetary boundaries that Benoît has been talking about in mind, and think about advancing needs of humanity, or in fact, as you put it, rethinking national security as international security?
Well, so section 7 of that report on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I wrote just last month, is entirely about hope. And I'll just give a few data points. We are, in my estimation, 40% of the way to that new thinking threshold of 1,000 nuclear weapons worldwide. Why? Because at the peak, there were 70,000 nuclear weapons. Today, we're at around 13,000. We've reduced by somewhere between a factor of 5 and 6. Another reduction by that factor would only take us down to about 2,300 weapons, not quite 1,000, but very close to it. So we're almost halfway there, but not quite. We're about 40% of the way to the new thinking threshold. I also see it as hopeful that a former Secretary of Defense, a former director of NSA, a former chair of the National Intelligence Council have signed the statement on rethinking national security. And my main reason for hope is my marriage. Dorothy and I were, as I said, were on the verge of divorce 40 years ago. She was ready to leave me because life was so impossible. Now we thank each other every day. And so that's my main reason for hope. And I'm going to end with one of my mentors' key observations. He called it the Noble Hypothesis. He said there are basically two hypotheses. The first is that humanity is capable of the radical changes required by nuclear weapons. And he said this in the 80s. He was born in the 1890s, died in the 1980s himself. Today, he would add a number of other threats as well. That humanity is capable of the radical changes required to overcome these threats. The less noble hypothesis is that we're doomed. If we accept the less noble hypothesis, he pointed out, we're doomed even if we had the capacity for change because we won't be motivated. Whereas if we assume the noble hypothesis, the worst that happens is we go down fighting, and the best that happens is we cheat the Grim Reaper where everyone says we have no chance. So why not assume the noble hypothesis?
Awesome. I love it. Benoît.
So yeah, I had two observations, and they connect to what Marty said about going down fighting. Because when in most conversations about dire subjects, like the ones we talk about, there is a requirement for hope or for optimism. And I want to end on a cautionary note here, because this should not be understood to mean or to be related to likelihood of success. Because if hope becomes a requirement to talk about possibilities for success, it can backfire in multiple ways. The requirement for hope can be an incentive to wait for others to act. Then it can also create incentives to understate the threats. Because look, if you say, that the picture is too dire, you're going to kill the hope. And that's something that we've done a lot. Hope could also be an incentive to fall for like techno-solutionism. So the reminder that I want to end on is that there are drivers for decent and just action that can exist regardless of considerations of hope or likelihood of success. Think about the very first meetings of the French resistance movement during World War II. They had no chance of success. If they thought they did, they were crazy, and they didn't. But their sense was, we're going to resist the intolerable out of a sense of honor, justice, regardless of likelihood of success. So I think if we want to define a notion of hope, let's make sure it's detached from likelihood of success and connected to concerns about justice and dignity.
Excellent. Thank you both so much. We have a few questions in the chat and a raised hand. So we'll go to the raised hand, but I'm just going to read one question and just comment really quickly, and then we'll go to a couple of live questions. There's a comment from Richard Tro, who says that a solar flare could be another civilization-ending cause, as could cyber terrorism. I could write a long list of all the things: a super volcano, an asteroid impact. There are a lot of ways in which humanity could end, but in most of those cases, we have very little or perhaps even no control. That's really different with nuclear weapons, because we created them and we can also get rid of them. So I do think that, you know, sort of equating it with other things outside of our control is not quite fair.
Well,
but let's, yeah, go ahead, Marty.
The other thing is we should assess the probability, the annualized probability of each of those risks. Nuclear weapons was 1% a year, in my estimation, a year ago. Now it's 1% a month. I think the risk of a super volcano, a super tsunami is much lower, although we ought to investigate these and then rank them and work on the most pressing problems.
And we do, and we have, you know, we in Yellowstone, we have super volcano being monitored, and we do look out for those asteroids and hope that we would have a way to divert their path, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, those are, we're talking about 1 in a million or more.
Per year,
right, per year, whereas or less in terms of the probability.
Yeah. Extinction level asteroid is 1 in 100 million per year.
Yeah, exactly. The one that wiped out the dinosaurs. Peter, let's go with your question.
Thank you. I'm Peter Metz. I'm in Massachusetts with Massachusetts Peace Action, a product of MIT, and I've loved this discussion, but it's much too academic. I want to pick up Benoit's last point, which is that an impossible, seemingly impossible, but noble goal, like the French resistance fighters who thought they had no chance, but they had to do it anyway, is in fact very attractive to people of goodwill. And just as John Kennedy challenged us to go to the moon when nobody thought that we had a way to do it in reality, and certainly not in a less than 10-year timetable, we should adopt a similarly bold, ennobling goal that will, I think, rally a lot of very good people. So I propose the total elimination of nuclear weapons within the decade. And as that happens, I co-chair a subcommittee of Massachusetts Peace Action, which is trying to work for that. What do you think of it?
So Peter, I'll answer, and then I'll let Benoît and Marty answer. But you know, Nuclear Peace Foundation has been committed to a world free of nuclear weapons for 40 years, and we've been part of ICAM. We were involved in negotiations on the TPNW, not me personally, but and we continue to be very, very heavily involved. I actually gave a statement at the UN at the end of September for the International Day for Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, and you can actually find the statement on the website. I can even maybe add it to the chat when Benoît and Marty speak, where I really make the argument for the moral imperative of total elimination of nuclear weapons. To me, truly, the number needs to be 0. Now, how you get there and whether you have intermediate goals is a question. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is now in force. Of course, it hasn't been signed or ratified by the 9 nuclear weapon states, who are the sort of most important, but there are also states that are benefiting from the nuclear umbrellas. There are also states that are hosting nuclear weapons on their territory. And really the goal for us, for NAPF, and I think for a lot of the other organizations, needs to be to universalize this treaty, to keep pushing. The more countries that join it, the better chance I think we'll have on pushing the needle. In the meantime, I don't think the US will sign it tomorrow. So working to bring the number down to something that reduces risk, I also think is a good idea. But yes, I agree with you. I would like to leave to my own children a world free of nuclear weapons. So that's certainly a goal I share. With you.
Can I just say that a goal of 0 is not enough. A goal has to have a timeline in order for it to really challenge people. And that was Kennedy's genius. He said within the decade. Now, that's why I think we should have something specific. We've all been working, so many of you have been working for 0 for a long, long time, but nobody's ever really challenged themselves as to, let's try getting there in our lifetime.
Yeah, so in Vienna, there were some conversations that I was even a part of in Vienna at the first meeting of states parties on the TPNW, like, you know, and there is a 10-year sort of time frame that's probably going to go in as the expectation. Once a country that has nuclear weapons joins, they would be given 10 years to eliminate all of their nuclear weapons. But whether or not something like, I was even thinking 2045, right, could be, you know, a great anniversary, 100th anniversary of the attacks in Japan, of the formation of the UN. And there are people who think that's too far into the future. And also that, you know, nobody sort of put a timeline on the end of apartheid or on, you know, the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and yet those things happen. So, you know, my sense is pushing, and really on the international front, convincing all countries, in fact, that they stand to lose something if nuclear weapons are used, and that this is not just a problem for, say, Europe and North America. If, you know, Russia and the US get into a nuclear war, it's a problem for everybody.
So my answer, first of all, Peter, I think you're very right to include a timeline. It's just like in what's the probability of a nuclear war is the wrong question. It's what's the probability of a nuclear war over the next year. It's the right, getting the right units. And so you're right to bring that into goals. Well, I do not advocate 0 only primarily because it creates so much antagonism, and calling it a state of acceptable risk does not. And it raises a whole bunch of questions. I'm not going to try to change what you're doing, but what I would suggest is if someone raises an objection saying we'll never get to 0, then say, okay, should we get to a state of acceptable? You feel that, but what would be a state of acceptable risk, and is the risk acceptable now? And use some of the examples from my report to show that it isn't.
I would just argue that it's probably going to be as hard to get to that goal as it is to 0.
Oh, it is. But it's much harder to argue against it at this point in time. And especially it raises the question of what is the current level of risk? Is it acceptable?
Yeah, but acceptable risk is not an ennobling goal. 0 is.
Okay.
Humankind is.
And what? Anything?
Yeah, two observations. Thank you, sir, for your comment and suggestion. One, simply to the question of timelines. There is an interesting study, it's a couple of studies by Ziemian and Moritz Kut, published in the Journal for Peace and Nuclear Disarmament, which have shown that without technological progress, if, you know, everything was favorable to it, we can dismantle the entire nuclear arsenal in a decade. So we have this sense of, if everything was favorable, how long would it take? So we know that there is no material impossibility. So that's kind of the first comment. The second one, since sorry, you were proposing, you're asking us to do things, so I'm going to do the same thing as you did. I'm going to ask you to do things. My project fundamentally is focused towards democracy. My sense is really, I want to inform people about things, and then they will choose whether they want nuclear weapons or not, because now the set of information they have is biased and incomplete. So really, if you accept that goal, the one claim that I would want to make is to say to whoever is not necessarily interested in the nuclear weapons policy question, to tell them, you cannot choose not to be affected by nuclear weapons policies. Because in most cases, and my students are like that, most cases, people feel, either there is nuclear war and we're dead anyway, or there is no nuclear war and we're much happier if we don't think about it. The question is, I think the key is to break that and to say, wait, even if there is no nuclear war, you are already mobilized by nuclear weapons policy as a target, if you're in a nuclear weapon state or a nuclear host, as a taxpayer, similarly, as someone who allows the head of state to use nuclear weapons on your behalf because that's the national security strategy. So my entry point for people who you want to make more aware of the nuclear weapon problem is to kill their escape strategy by telling them I can choose not to be affected, and tell them that this is not a choice you have. The choice you have is whether you're active about this issue or not. That would be my suggestion.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Benoît. Let's go to, we can probably take one or two more questions if Marty and Benoît, you're okay with the time. Do we have Vansh, sorry, I can't see your entire name. Vansh done, yeah.
Vansh is just fine. Thank you so much. So, thank you so much for the very interesting discussion. I was very privileged to have been able to hear this today. And my question is about nuclear deterrence in specific, and how we believe that nuclear deterrence is always working. And even if we are lucky enough to come out of this war without the use of nuclear weapons, it would confirm that hypothesis again, that nuclear weapons is what did not cause the war. But I would just like to mention something that I've been researching on previously, and thanks to Professor Pelopidas, I've had the opportunity to think about it in the first place, about how the idea of nuclear deterrence can lead to limited wars. That because we believe that nuclear deterrence exists, wars would not escalate, and then powers can instigate conflicts in the first place because of nuclear weapons. So would we, with this thinking in mind, could we analyze nuclear deterrence to causing conflicts in the first place and not preventing conflicts? And when two countries go about with these calculations of how can they have war within a nuclear setup, they get into an estimation of a nuclear threshold, which is a very risky one, which can always lead to escalation in the future. Especially if you look at the India-Pakistan conflict in the past few years, you will see evidence regarding that. So how does that change the narrative around nuclear deterrence in the first place?
Marty or Benoît?
Okay. Well,
yeah, go ahead,
there's a section in our book, How Logical is Nuclear Deterrence? And it's got a number of reasons why it's not logical. I mean, the most fundamental is we have to be logical enough. Our adversary needs to be logical enough to be deterred by our nuclear threats, whereas we have to be illogical enough not to be deterred by his comparable threats. This is summarized in a 1995 US Stratcom white paper, which says that the US should cultivate a national persona that is vindictive and irrational if our vital interests are threatened, because that produces fear, which is the working force of deterrence. What happens if both sides try being vindictive and irrational?
Nothing good. Great, let's go ahead. Benoît, did you want to comment, or is it okay?
Yes. I'm from New Zealand, and my suggestion is that if you want to have a peaceful world, you need to be able to work peacefully with all the nations in it. Once you developed peaceful relationships, then you diffused all the threats that provoke not only nuclear weapons, but all the other weapons. Now this is a big task, but actually New Zealand has achieved a significant part of that, in that we are able to engage with nearly all the major powers, not Russia, unfortunately, at this stage, but and to establish this comprehensive diplomatic engagement with all the benefits of trade and good relationships, the cultural integration and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's
Agreed,
and that is a possible approach.
Yeah, I very much agree, and that was the fundamental idea of that you can't separate nuclear, conventional, interpersonal, foreign relations. They're all part of the same system.
Absolutely.
I just want to say one, thank you, sir. Just want to say one thing to your point, which is, I think, peculiar to the nuclear condition. Just, working peacefully, you could say working peacefully is also getting people to say that they know the possibilities of unwanted nuclear explosions. But one of the findings of my scholarship is that saying that you know about this possibility of unwanted nuclear explosions is not enough to actually believe in what you know and act consistently. What I found in a campaign of interviews is that even people who are dedicated disarmament activists, they're having a hard time believing in the possibility of unwanted nuclear explosions. So we should not lose sight of how challenging it is to keep in mind that possibility and to make it tangible and meaningful to us. Popular culture was very productive and effective, even on elites, on President Reagan and Ambassador Clement during the Cold War. One of the findings of the team is that post-Cold War popular culture no longer helps us overcome our disbelief, and that's a pity.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's the role that popular culture and media, etc., have is really huge. And actually, one of the things to me that have been really distressing since the war started is this almost normalization of the idea of use of nuclear weapons in the media. They just didn't write about it or talk about it for essentially decades, and now all of a sudden, like, oh, will Putin use a nuclear weapon, as if that's a sort of a normal question to be asking. So let's go just to one more question, I'm sorry, and then we'll have to end. So Jean Stevens.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on that point of popular culture. And I happened to discover a film recently in 1983. It won the Academy Award for Best Short Documentary. It was called If You Love This Planet. And it was Dr. Helen Caldicott speaking. And I wish that, and also this film, the television event about the day after, if there was a way of getting that popular culture out to show how those films really dramatically made a difference with Gorbachev and Reagan. So if you could comment on that. Thank you for taking my question.
Benoît, do you want to take this?
Yeah, so on Reagan, we have evidence about the impact of the day after on him through his diary and through like indirect testimony, because the film was shown at the White House. And so obviously Reagan was an actor and knew Jason Robards. And so one of the things that the day after does is that he turns solid Jason Robards into literally a powerless doctor who gets overwhelmed by the amount of nuclear violence. So that was very impactful on Reagan, and he went down to the nuclear war planners to tell them that this was all kind of insane. And yeah, the other observation, which is, I guess, unexpected, is that one of the things that we found is that the impactful films, so what I'm talking about is a set of surveys that we did in 2018 and 2019 of the European public. And when we told them what kind of popular culture kind of impacted your understanding of nuclear weapons issues, we expected that they would mention famous directors or famous movies like Stanley Kubrick, Strangelove, War Game. No, the two that were massively overrepresented were Threads and The Day After. So, TV movies by not famous directors. Why? Because they do one particular thing, which is they haunt you. They don't give you an ability to close the door between the movie theater and your life. Most nuclear movies allow you to do that, either by giving you the spectacle of the end of the world, think about the end of Strangelove, or by giving you the relief of it didn't happen. And that's the end of War Games. Threads and The Day After do not allow you this closure. And that may be something to pursue if we think about renewing popular culture to recreate awareness about nuclear vulnerabilities. Thank you for your question.
The only thing I would add is that it's very important to have something in popular culture, a movie. People, when they see movies, become a part of it, and it hits them at a gut level in a way that no learned report or paper will do. So yes, very much so, Jean.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Benoît and Marty, so very much for joining us today for this enlightening conversation. And thank you to everyone who came to listen and for all the great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to answer all of them, but perhaps we'll do this conversation again at another time. So thank you all. And this concludes our program, unless Benoît, it seems like you want to say something, or?
Yeah, just one quick thing. To whoever wanted to ask a question and couldn't do it, or thought my answer was really frustrating, you have my email address right behind me. It's written in blue. Please email me, because I definitely don't want to leave you with a frustration regarding my replies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana.
You're very welcome. And we will make this recording available to everyone who participated, as well as on our website, and we'll share it on the website and in social media. So the recording will be, 10% reduction per year for 10 years. I like it. All right. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Benoît and Marty, so much for sharing.
Thank you, Ivana, and thank you everyone in the audience for all that you do. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Bye.